Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
2025 will see more electric vehicles in the automotive market than ever before. We're going to see nameplates, makes, and models upwards of 125 to choose from. But are prospective car buyers losing interest in getting into the EV space? A report by EY Canada indicates that of the almost half of Canadians, 48%, who are shopping for a vehicle in the next year, only half would consider an EV, which is down 2% from the previous year and lower than the rest of the global market. Respondents to the survey cite issues that have dogged EV sales since they were first introduced: charging times, access to chargers, higher purchase price, range anxiety, and replacement costs for the batteries. Well, today on The Big Story, we're digging deeper into the data and looking at the myths and realities of electric vehicles and what needs to change to create that spark for sales. Jason Clifton is a partner in consulting electric mobility practice at EY Canada and co-author of the report. Jason, thanks for being here.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Jason, we've seen the push for electric vehicles, the vast array of models available, but now that the early adopters are in, there really doesn't seem to be as much enthusiasm. So what is your data showing specifically?
What we're seeing now is a little bit of the conversation of the curve with the early folks jumping into the market to go buy. If you look at now the early majority and moving over, one of the good things we've seen is at least a tipping point of stabilizing, purchasing, and the fact that EVs are going to be here to stay. So I think that the first piece would be that is the case. I think now the question becomes is how do you maintain that momentum? And so our studies have shown so far, just from an intent perspective, if you look at 2021, 2022, 23, 24, it's seen 35%, 46, 52%, and then ultimately it's dropped down now by a couple of percentage points in terms of EV buying intent. It's showing a bit more of a leveling off. Now, if you look at the whys behind that, there's a multitude of components. I think that the takeaway is it's here to stay now because we're into that early majority. There's enough individuals realizing and thinking through it. And now it's a matter of how do we kind of continue to keep that momentum going? Because I think the big benefit, of course, is the environment. And then the big benefit, which I think a whole lot of consumers may not 100% yet understand, is just the cost savings that are going to really come into their pockets in terms of owning electric vehicles, which is good. But yeah, our data shows that that level of intent at this stage is waning just a little bit.
Is that a messaging problem? I'm not seeing a lot of ads, for example, where the automakers are really marketing these vehicles in any different way than they would have, internal combustion engine vehicles.
So absolutely. I think, if you look at the evolution of where we have been with electric vehicles, so we've made a lot of good strides. You are right. There is still this perception of quote unquote range anxiety. I think so maybe I'll start with any new technology, any new innovation like this takes time for everybody to adopt. And I think we're all familiar with it, right? If you look at how things have progressed. I think one of the things is, and you're right, maybe some of the marketing hasn't changed per se, that range anxiety is starting to decrease in terms of just people understanding, and also with new technology, these vehicles are able to go further. So if you do look at some of the marketing, they are touting now ranges actually in excess in some cases of internal combustion engines, right? I think, again, we still have to deal with the upfront cost because you've got this new technology. Everything still has to come down. We are seeing in some cases parity. So there are some opportunities there where consumers are starting to get educated now as they go in and actually see that in some cases you can get as low with the incentives that an internal combustion EV vehicle work. I think there's a lot of pieces now around just how do you sort of maintain an expensive battery replacement, and there's kind of now some forward-looking thoughts around all of this. The charging stations also becomes a little bit of an issue, just in terms of across Canada. So if you look at how many EVs we need to get onto the road for when we need to hit some of our federal requirements, those EV stations are not getting put into the ground quick enough and fast enough as well. So then you couple a bit of the range anxiety, the purchase costs, the battery replacement, charging stations with the new technology, and you stand back and you say, okay, is this the right thing to do? Those are and continue to be some of the larger issues that we have found in our study that are still things that, just careful I say, it's not to myth bust it, but that some of these have already actually, based on the information we have, are not really as big of an issue as we perceive it to be.
Well, the issue you mentioned, the issue of incentives is this seems to be a very large component of buyer intentions. Some provinces have them, some do not.
Correct.
The federal jurisdiction is different, and yet the feds actually, they're saying by 2035 they want to see the only things being purchased electric vehicles. Now, whether or not one agrees with that, or if mandates work, or if that's actually reasonable, considering, again, Canada, vast country, different dynamics depending where you live. Does an EV work necessarily? Again, that's 10 years from now. But at the same time, it almost sounds like the government still has to do more from a money basis to get things really moving.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think if you look at our article, we'd noted just, I think part of the conversation is that we still need to keep getting the government, the utilities, investors, sort of everybody on the same page to continue to drive to the same agenda. And the incentives part is just a very important element to get consumers to continue to jump in, to allow for that momentum to get created. Now, our point of view would still be the tipping point has already occurred, and this is not going to get undone. I think if we want to accelerate, just to your comments, to get to those targets, and that's where the government is setting it, the government needs to continue to try and support as many of those incentives. Now, we're still seeing a lot of other incentives. If you look at the city level, municipal level, either studies, different offers and different dollars to try and move individuals to go down that path. But you are correct. It doesn't help if we start to now remove incentives when we actually need to be helping push that momentum with the early majority in. And then number two, really help get people over these series of anxieties, I suppose, at the end of the day. And maybe just on the anxiety, I would just give one quick analogy. It almost is as though you're looking at your kind of flip phone to when you move to your iPhone. And very few people will actually go back. If you look at the amount of technology that's currently in these electric vehicles, there is just a lot of different opportunities to continue to enjoy your ride, do different things. And I think the piece of just having to charge your vehicle and convert the language from, you're going in to fill up with gas and how many liters to now how many kilowatts you're needing to do your charge and the cost for electricity. There are a few things that we just need to get over, but what's going to end up happening is people just enjoy the new technology layers that are in these vehicles. They're upgradable. They have a lot of other different features that make them really, really good. And so typically we found just when we looked at consumers, very few of them want to actually give up their electric vehicle once they've tipped over, because those anxieties dissipate very quick. They actually enjoy the ride. The level of technology that's in some of these vehicles is just interesting and exciting and makes their ride and experience a lot more enjoyable. I still think we have to come back to just like the charges themselves, and getting more in the ground will just help incentivize individuals to procure more of these vehicles, right?
Do you think, though, that an uneven or to some extent unpredictable political environment, though, also weighs on this? Because, look, you're going to have a certain category of the market that doesn't want to be necessarily told what vehicle it needs to drive or what style.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, look, cars are in, the motor vehicle sector has been ingrained into the psyche, how they look, how much power they have, all these things. And that's, potentially a tough mindset to change. And when you bring politics into it as well, you're not going to take away my internal combustion engine. That's going to be a bit of a tough nut to crack.
So you are correct. And I think, just in your opening remarks of the types of choices of vehicles, that's indicative of the fact that as human beings, we just enjoy having that. If you look at our studies, we're actually showing an increase in intent to procure vehicles generally. And then if you look at the types of vehicles and everything else, you're correct. It kind of, for Canada, from an EV perspective, we've got a little bit of a drop there for a couple of percentage points. But I think the political landscape right now is definitely, in my mind, weighs into the decision of buying these vehicles one way or the other. And I think part of that becomes, will there be these incentives? What is the fiscal landscape going to be in terms of, does the government pull them away or not? Now, one could also argue that's probably an incentive for people to jump in before we see any big changes in the political landscape here. Certainly south of the border, it's certainly ironic when you've got Trump's perspectives being offered, and then at the same time, you've got the world leader, let's call it that way, with Elon Musk jumping in and being on the same page as Trump, right? So you've got some very interesting dynamics. I think within Canada, if you look at our Liberal government and where we're going to be going in the future and what the potential future could be, those incentives are very important because not everyone can afford some of these cars at maybe the current dollars and cents. But when you apply the incentives and you get parity, that makes a huge difference in terms of everybody being able to afford one. And so the answer would be yes in a short answer there. It's just that people, when you have so much change and then you've got these layers on top of it all, it becomes very tough to kind of see through when people are saying their intent is adjusting. And maybe just one other piece, that's kind of why we're seeing a little bit of an influx in terms of hybrid vehicles. So people get the notion of the understanding of what electric does. They get the understanding of the environment. They get the understanding of the cost savings. And this is, for me, where that's going to be such an amazing piece for a lot of consumers over time. The question now just becomes, that you hedge your bets? And that's where those hybrid vehicles have also become a good alternative, I suppose, if you will, to kind of bridge between internal combustion and electric at the same time.
Well, my last question, though, to that point is, are the automakers building the right type of EVs that customers are looking for? The idea of a pickup truck or a Tesla Cyber truck, these are massive vehicles when, on the surface, a lot of people look at an EV as maybe just a commuter vehicle, something short distances, not something that's going to haul a trailer or, pull a tree out of the ground.
So I think you are absolutely correct on that. There is and has been a shift to the sort of larger SUV truck levels. And I think part of that is, if you look at the evolution just in terms of the original equipment manufacturers, gone are the days of maybe higher volume to make up for a little bit of the lower margin, and now the shift to a higher price to try and increase that margin base. I think there is going to be a place here now where manufacturers are going to start to see that a few entry-level cars at a cheaper price, but effectively it comes back to the consumer's preference, just like you made at the beginning again. I think within Canada as well, we also have an interesting terrain. There's there's some distances and a couple of other things. You're spot on that for the majority of users, having just a local in-city car will make the majority of everything you need can be done on electric without a doubt. I think now some of the question becomes, is the long range outside of cities? And even there, we're still showing that electric can make a difference.
That's Jason Clifton, a partner at EY Canada. And coming up after the break, we'll look deeper into how the marketing of EVs might need to change. Erik Novak is a professor of business and sustainability at Seneca College in Toronto, an automotive journalist, editor-in-chief of the Novak report. Now, he's tested many of the EVs that are currently on the market, and we've reached out to get his perspective on where consumers are with electric vehicles going into 2025. Erik, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Mike.
When you hear the statistics from the EY report about the buyer intentions for Canadian consumers and the slowing pace of interest in electric vehicles, is that frustrating? You've been driving these vehicles, you've been testing them, you're a proponent of them. That's your backstory. Let's be upfront about that. And you hear about these concerns about, the range anxiety, the charging, the cost, all of these things. Does this come down to an issue of messaging, that consumers need to hear perhaps a different message about why EVs are the future? Because it seems like it's right now it's kind of at a plateau.
100%. There's a lot to do with messaging. It's often not what we say, it's how we're saying it. We could talk about how EV sales being in decline. Yet at the same time, they're still growing. In fact, in the quarter three results in 2024 show we've had record levels of growth in Canada. We're still increasing our sales quarter after quarter. So we're still growing up. And when we talk about, the apprehension, because the truth is, you know, it's a natural cycle of news and information is we always want to talk about the challenges, despite the challenges being, very small. We're not hearing stories about, someone like, today's breaking news is, Mr. Johnson from Oakville headed to work downtown and came back in his EV with no problems. We've got a news team on the scene to get his impressions of it. I mean, that's what really is happening more than anything. But that's not the main conversation that's out there. We're hearing about that rare instance where somebody is trying to get a great distance. I mean, how many times does a Canadian on average drive more than the current average range of an EV in a day, in a year? I mean, maybe a handful of times, yet, we're very attuned to buy something, a vehicle that meets that very rare need, maybe 5 days a year, but for 361 days a year, it's fine. We buy pickup trucks, not because we need them, but because one day we might have to go off-roading somewhere into the wilderness across a mountain range to buy bread, because that's what the projections of commercials show. Yet the reality is certainly much different. So, part of the problem is really how these stories are being projected and being told, and people just pick up on that.
But does that come back to a failure of the automakers with their marketing? I mean, they instead of building a vehicle that is affordable, they immediately went to $100,000 electric pickup truck, which we don't need.
Well, that's certainly a big problem. And we saw with Ford and GM, I mean, when Ford pulled back on their projections, partly it was because they were, again, as you say, launching the wrong kinds of EVs off the market. They thought their F-150 would be the big seller as it is, and it didn't always convert well because people were looking for something more economical and small, lower in price, lower in size. But you're right, it's how they project it. I've done a talk before to the business groups and to my students where, if you compare what an average gas engine commercial would be, it's always just romanticized, emotional kind of, we're getting out into the wilderness. And in the beginning, when you even saw an EV ad, it was usually about apprehension. I'd say, no, it's okay. You'll be fine. You're going to get there. I mean, that's getting better. Of recently, you see more ads for EVs when you do that are more, tugging to that sort of that aspirational side. But by and large, that's never been the case up until only recently.
Do you think too that we hear about the economic uncertainty and watching their budgets and prices for everything going up, and then they're presented with the option of buying an electric vehicle, which at the purchase price has a higher price point than a regular a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. Again, does that come back to the idea that it needs to be marketed better about the long-term costs involved with owning an EV versus a traditional gas motor powered vehicle, and also incentives? People love carrots, and they don't so much like the stick. And when you hear about mandates, and you have to do something as opposed to maybe you should, and here's why, maybe that would be a better marketing pitch.
It seems it's very common that we tend to have sort of, spending myopia. We only look at the price of, say, in a car, your financing price or your monthly leasing costs. Yet the reality is, when it comes to owning a vehicle, there is a total vehicle cost of ownership. And so the right way to look at pricing, even though there may be about a 10, 15%, surcharge or surplus on a premium, I should say, on an EV currently, but which is still coming further down all the time. When you compare it against the fact that, if you can charge at home and you're charging overnight, your savings compared to the gas station is in excess of 90%. I spend probably $2,000 to $3,000 in gas a year. What's 10% of that? And there's virtually, it's not a no maintenance idea in an EV, but it's far, far less. I mean, there's 2,000 moving parts in an internal combustion vehicle. There's about 20 in an EV. You have to look. I mean, a financial planner who's trying to get a kid to talk about saving for retirement is talking big picture. We understand this line of thinking. It's the same thing that applies here. Yet for some reason, we fixate on that one purchase price, yet forget all the other costs that you spend every single month on your vehicle.
One question I have had, though, about the transition to electric, and again, this idea that by 2035, the target is all EV sales and only EV sales. Is that truly, though, a realistic idea for Canada, and I'm talking geographically, and also just the workings of the inner city, where you're going to need charging points and you're going to need all these things that currently don't exist. It's not that long of a time frame, a decade, to get all of this stuff in place. Is that a realistic target?
So currently, just to correct you on what the targets are, what the benchmark is 100% of new vehicle sales being zero emission by 2035. It's 20% by 26, it's 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2035. But that's only new car sales, and it's zero emission, which is not only EV, but it also includes plug-in hybrid, and theoretically, it also includes hydrogen, but there's like no infrastructure. That's kind of a non-starter. So you can still be driving, in 2035, 2040, your gas vehicle. You could buy a new gas vehicle the day before the deadline, is enacted, and you can drive it for as long as you want. No one's taking away your gas cars. It's just the new stuff coming on the lot is going to be restricted. So the day that's going to come when we're actually going to be in a situation where everybody is driving is a lot longer in horizon than 2035. It might be, 2040, 2045 before we're ever at that point. So it's not that we have 10, 11 years left, which is still a long horizon. We probably really have 20 years, 25 years before we actually have to worry about that. And in that moment, it's not the other argument that people don't seem to realize. It's, yeah, sure, demand is growing, but it's almost like one side of the ledger is moving, but the other is not. There is already plans for increasing in generation. But the other flip side, too, is if we're getting to a point where, gasoline vehicle sales are dropping, so oil demand would be dropping. And, we don't ever talk about the excessive amount of energy that the oil and gas sector needs. So if they're not producing, if they're not extracting, that energy is not being used by them. It's going back into the grid. So there are offsets being, factored in as well.
Yeah, that was my final question, was the fact, do we have the electricity generation capacity for this?
I mean, there's always variables involved, but every sort of academic study, every engineering study I've seen has indicated that we will be fine. But again, it's trying to envision what it will look like. It's trying to imagine things. And, even the best prognosticators aren't the best at communicating things. Trying to getting an engineer or a scientist to convey basic messaging is not always easy. So, sometimes the messaging is hard to get across. But, it's already said that, the total estimates for the amount of energy is needed by electric vehicles, which are also getting more efficient all the time as well. I mean, if we're all driving Hummer EVs, well, that's one thing. That's like a gas guzzler of EVs. But if we're all driving the kind of EVs that I think some people want, which are far more efficient, just a comparison in terms of what we could use, they say that pump jacks, which, are all over the landscape in North America, a single pump jack uses in 1 month the same amount of energy that a Tesla Model 3 would need over 3 years. So, it's not as big a draw on energy for electric vehicles as we think.
I have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Erik.
My pleasure, Mike.
Thanks again to Erik Novak, professor at Seneca College and editor-in-chief of the Novak Report, and to Jason Clifton from EY Canada for joining me on the Big Story podcast. Follow us on X at the Big Story FPN and leave your comments. We'd love to hear from you. You can also listen to the Big Story and other frequency podcasts on our Seeker app. That's Seekr. Thanks for listening.